The morning matron Edna Price read August Voss's will aloud. Every girl in the dining hall laughed. Not polite laughter, not nervous laughter. The full, ugly kind. Heads thrown back, mouths open wide, sound bouncing off stone walls until it filled every corner of the room. 40 girls at long tables with tin cups and cold oatmeal, and every single one of them laughing at Clara Voss. Matron Price stood at the front with the probate letter in one hand and the permanent expression of a woman who had long ago decided that hope was a form of foolishness. She had a narrow face, a tight white collar, and eyes that assessed everything, including grief, for its practical value. When the laughter finally died, she folded the letter, looked directly at Clara, and said, "Well, your grandfather has left you a bridge over dry land and a barn full of weather. I suppose even the dead can make a joke." Clara was 16 years old. She sat at the end of the third table with her hands flat on the wood and her face absolutely still. She had learned a stillness the way other girls learned needlework. Out of necessity, practiced until it became second nature. Show nothing. Give them nothing to aim at. But something was happening beneath that stillness. Something small and hot, like a coal catching air. A bridge over dry land. She turned the words over in her mind while the laughter ran its course. A man with no money. She knew August Voss had died with almost nothing. Had spent timber and labor to lift a path into the air between his own front door and his own barn. That was not foolishness. That was evidence. Evidence of a question she did not yet understand, but could feel the shape of, the way you feel a door in a dark room before your hand finds the handle. Matron Price moved on to other business. Clara looked down at the cold oatmeal in her bowl. In her coat pocket, folded into a square no larger than her palm, was a piece of paper she had found 3 days earlier, slipped beneath her pillow sometime in the night. An address. Glen Rock Basin, Colorado. A road name and a distance from the nearest town. The handwriting was not her grandfather's. She did not recognize it at all. She had said nothing about it to anyone. But the letter Clara found in the tin box on her very first night at the property, that letter had not been written by her grandfather. It had been written by the very woman who had just read the will aloud. Clara would not know that for weeks, but when she did, it would change everything she thought she understood about the choice that had brought her here. Clara left St. Bridwell's 4 days later. Matron Price did not try to stop her. She did sign the release papers with a quickness that suggested relief, and she pressed $2 into Clara's hand at the door with the expression of someone settling a debt they were glad to be finished with. Clara took the money without comment and walked to the train station alone. The train took her as far as Glenwood Springs. From there, a supply wagon heading toward the ranching settlements agreed to carry her for 50 cents and the promise she wouldn't ask questions. She kept that promise. She sat in the back among flour sacks and fence wire and watched the country change. The towns getting smaller, the fences getting rougher, the road getting worse until it was barely a road at all. The driver left her at a crossroads 4 miles from the property as the sun was dropping behind the mountains. He pointed at a notch in the ridge. Voss Place is that direction. Road gets mean after dark. Then he drove away without looking back. Clara walked the last 4 miles with her carpet bag in one hand and the address paper in the other, though she no longer needed it. The wind came off the open range in long, steady pushes that flattened her coat against her back and made her eyes water. The grass was short and silver. The air smelled of pine resin and cold stone and something else, something mineral and sharp that she would later learn was the particular smell of Colorado at altitude when snow was still weeks away but already making promises. When she finally saw the property, she understood why people laughed. The cabin leaned slightly east, as though it had been listening for bad news so long that it had given up standing straight. The roof had a visible sag in the middle. One window was boarded over. The other was intact but filmed with grime so thick the glass had gone brown. 30 yards away across open ground sat the barn, larger than the cabin, in somewhat better repair, but with doors that hung crooked and a corner patched with boards that didn't match anything else. And between them, running from the cabin's front step to the barn's main door, stood a line of timber posts, maybe a dozen of them, driven into the ground at careful, even intervals. 4 feet high, nothing on top, no planks, no rails, just posts, rising out of the grass like broken teeth, going nowhere. Clara stood in the last of the evening light and looked at all of it. She almost turned around. The thought was specific and practical. Walk back to the crossroads, wait for a wagon going east, return to Denver. Tell Matron Price she had been right. Sleep in a doorway before sleeping in this. But she did not turn around. Not because she was brave. Because those posts were too deliberate to be random, too evenly spaced. Someone had measured. Someone had planned. And that someone had died before finishing, which meant the plan was either impossible or the person had simply run out of time. She wanted to know which one. She pushed open the cabin door. Inside, mouse droppings, old wood smoke, cold air, a stove with no fire, a shelf with flour enough for 4 meals in a tin that had been chewed through at one corner, pegs on the wall labeled in pencil, tobacco tins with nails sorted by size, a square and plumb bob hung together on a single hook, and on the highest shelf, a row of wooden stakes with dates burned into them, each one carrying 2 sets of numbers she didn't understand yet. She went to the barn next, thinking she might find a blanket, or at least a cleaner place to sleep. She found Pearl instead. The child was in the back corner of the lowest stall, tucked behind a pile of old feed sacks, her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes open in the dark. Large, dark eyes that caught the last slant of light through the barn's crooked door and held it like still water. She looked to be about 6 years old. She was thin in the way that means a body has been working hard on very little for a long time. Her dress had been mended so many times in so many places that it was difficult to say what color it had originally been. She did not speak. She did not move. Beside her, pressed against her left side, was a dog, medium-sized, rough-coated, the color of old ash. The dog was thin too, and it lifted its head when Clara came in and made a sound, not quite a growl, more a low note of warning, and then laid its head back down across the child's feet. Clara stood still in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at the child. She looked at the dog. She looked at the cracked wooden walls of the barn and the crooked doors and the last gray light coming through the gaps. "How long have you been here?" she said. The child said nothing. She watched Clara with those still dark eyes and did not move. Clara set her carpet bag down just inside the door. She did not come closer. She sat down on an overturned bucket near the entrance, where the child could see her clearly, and she stayed there without speaking until the light was fully gone. That night, she slept in the stall across from Pearl with her coat pulled over her and the cold coming up through the floor. Sometime in the small hours, she woke to find the dog had moved. It was no longer beside Pearl. It was lying across the threshold of Clara's stall, facing the barn door, its chin on its paws, keeping watch. In the morning, before the light was fully up, Clara climbed to the barn loft. She was looking for blankets or tools or anything useful. What she found behind a false wall of boards that were spaced just slightly too evenly to be accidental was a pine crate wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, 14 notebooks, each one labeled in a tight, careful hand. Drift measurements, storm records, dates going back nearly 30 years, diagrams of the land, the buildings, the way snow moved across the open ground in every kind of wind. And at the bottom of the crate, a tin box. Inside the tin box, a letter. The handwriting was not her grandfather's. Clara's hands went still. She read the letter once, quickly, then again more slowly. Then she sat down on the loft floor with the letter in her lap and the 14 notebooks stacked beside her and the cold coming through the boards and the sound of Pearl moving around below. She recognized the handwriting now. It was the same as the address note she had found beneath her pillow. The same careful, upright letters. The same hand. And at the bottom of the letter, a signature, Edna Price. Clara sat with that for a long time. Then she climbed back down the ladder. Pearl was standing in the middle of the barn floor, watching the ladder, watching Clara descend. The dog, she would name him Kettle for reasons that would make sense later, sat at Pearl's feet. Clara looked at the child. She looked at the dog. She looked at the barn door, and through it, at the line of posts crossing the yard toward the cabin, patient and deliberate in the early light. "This is our home now," she said. Pearl did not answer, but for the first time since Clara had arrived, the child looked not at Clara's face, but at something just past her, at the light coming through the barn door. At the yard, at the post standing in the frost. And very slowly, so slightly that Clara almost missed it, Pearl nodded. The first week nearly killed all three of them. Clara had 17 cents, a tin of flour with a chewed corner, a half-wild goat that wanted nothing to do with any of them, and a child who had not spoken a single word. The flour stretched to 4 meals if she was careful. She was careful. She gave Pearl the larger portion every time and told herself she wasn't hungry, which was a lie her body stopped believing by the 3rd day. Pearl ate slowly and without complaint. She watched Clara with those careful eyes, watching the way Clara rationed the flour, watching the way Clara's hands moved when she worked, watching everything with the quiet attention of a child who had learned that the world was a place where things disappeared without warning, and that the best you could do was pay close attention to what remained. Kettle ate whatever Clara could spare, which was not much. He didn't complain either. He was that kind of dog. The goat was a problem. She was a small, gray, deeply suspicious animal that August Voss had apparently kept for milk, though she showed no interest in being milked by anyone she hadn't personally approved of, and she had not approved of Clara. Clara spent the better part of 2 days chasing her around the property before she finally cornered the animal against the fence on the eastern side and stood there, breathing hard, looking at the goat, and the goat looking back. "I'm not your enemy," Clara said. The goat said nothing, but she stopped trying to escape. It was a start. By the end of that first week, Clara had coaxed 3 cups of milk from the goat, set 2 rabbit snares using instructions from the 3rd of August's notebooks, and located a root cellar behind the cabin that held 11 jars of preserves, mostly chokecherry jam and pickled beets, but real food, sealed and waiting. She rationed those too, but the cold was the real enemy. The cabin stove worked barely, but wood was short. Clara had found a small stack behind the barn, enough for perhaps another week at current use. After that, she would need to cut her own. She had found an axe in the barn, heavy, with a cracked handle wrapped in leather, and a stand of lodgepole pine on the slope above the property, maybe half a mile up. The problem was the matches. She had a box of them when she arrived, 43 in total. She had been careful, but the stove was temperamental, and 2 nights had required multiple attempts, and by the end of the first week, she had 11 matches left. Then 8. Then, after a particularly cold night when the wind found every gap in the cabin walls, and the stove went out twice, 3 matches. She sat on the cabin floor that morning with the matchbox in her hand and thought about what it meant. 3 matches between them and a cold that, in another month, would reach temperatures that could kill a person in an hour. The nearest town was 4 miles away. She had 17 cents. A box of matches cost 5 cents, which she had, but the walk to town and back in the wind, with Pearl too small to keep up, and Kettle too thin to be reliable in the cold, it was a calculation she didn't like. She opened August's notebooks instead. She had been reading them every evening by the stovelight, working through them in order, slowly learning the language of what he had been doing out here for 30 years. He wrote the way a careful man thinks. Precisely, without sentiment, but with an underlying current of something that felt almost like joy. He had loved this problem, the way snow moved, the way wind carried its load and then surrendered it, the way a well-placed obstacle could redirect an entire drift or catch one where you didn't want it. On the 4th evening, she found the entry about fire starting. August had written it in the winter of 1871, after a stretch when he'd run low on matches and had to work out an alternative. He described the process in careful detail. The right kind of stone, the char cloth he'd made from a piece of old cotton in a sealed tin, the specific angle of strike, the patience required. He had drawn a small diagram. He had noted which stones in the creek bed were flint-bearing and how to identify them. Clara read the entry 3 times. Then she put on her coat and went to the creek. It took her most of that morning to find the right stones and most of the afternoon to get the technique working. Her hands were clumsy with cold. She ruined the first piece of char cloth by opening the tin too soon. She struck the stones at the wrong angle 6 times before she found the one that threw sparks. But the 7th strike caught, and the char cloth glowed, and she transferred it to a nest of dried grass. And she blew, gently, steadily, the way August's notebook said. And the fire came. Pearl had been watching from the doorway. When the flame took hold, she crossed the room and crouched beside Clara and looked at the small fire in Clara's hands with an expression that was the closest thing to wonder that Clara had seen on her face. "My grandfather figured that out," Clara said, "before I was born." Pearl looked at her. Then she looked back at the fire. That evening, the rabbit snare held 1 rabbit, small but real. Clara skinned it the way the trapping manual described and made a thin stew with beets from the root cellar and the last of the flour. She gave Pearl the meat and ate the broth herself and called it enough. She was not going to let this child go hungry. Whatever else happened, that was the line. But she almost broke it that fourth night. Pearl was asleep. Kettle was asleep across the doorway. The stove had settled into a low, steady burn, and the cabin was almost warm, and Clara sat alone on the floor with her back against the wall and thought, clearly and specifically, about what she was doing. She was a 16-year-old girl with no money, no family, no legal standing, and a child who had appeared from nowhere with no papers and no past that anyone in this valley seemed to know about. The county could come any day and take Pearl. The court could take the land. The winter was going to get much worse before it got better, and she was already rationing food and counting matches and lying to herself about how hungry she was. She could give Pearl to the county home. The child would have food, warmth, other children. She would be alive and fed, which was more than Clara could promise right now. She could sell the land to whoever would buy it. The man at the mercantile in town had already mentioned that a rancher named Wade Harmon had interest in the Voss property. $10, maybe. Enough to get back to Denver. Enough to start something else. It was the reasonable thing, the logical thing. Kettle lifted his head from the doorway and looked at her. He didn't make a sound. He just looked at her with his tired, serious eyes, and then he got up and walked across the cabin and lay down beside Pearl and put his chin on her feet. Clara watched him do it. She watched Pearl's small chest rise and fall in the firelight. She watched Kettle close his eyes again, settled and certain, as though there were no question at all about where he was supposed to be. She didn't write the letter to Wade Harmon that night. She didn't write it any night after that, though she thought about it 3 more times before the month was out. Each time, something stopped her. The notebooks, or Pearl's face, or Kettle looking at her with that quiet, implacable certainty. She was going to figure this out. She was going to build what August had started. She was going to find out if he was right. Haakon Strand arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Clara. She heard his horse before she saw him. Hooves on frozen ground, the slow creak of a saddle. A low voice talking to the animal in what she would later learn was Norwegian. She came out of the barn with a length of timber on her shoulder and found a man who looked older than the mountains sitting on a bay mare at the edge of the property, studying the line of posts in the yard with the expression of someone reading a text they had been trying to find for a long time. He was perhaps 70, perhaps older. White beard cut close to his jaw, eyes the color of faded denim, hands that were spotted and gnarled but still looked like they knew what they were for. He sat his horse with the careful stillness of a man whose body had learned to ration its energy. He looked at the posts for a long time before he looked at Clara. "You built that?" he asked. "My grandfather started it. I'm continuing. August Voss." He said the name the way you say the name of someone you argued with for years and respected despite yourself. I knew him, played checkers at the line shack below Willow Creek, argued about snow every time. He swung down from the horse, moving carefully but without weakness. "What did you argue about? Whether snow had rules?" Haakon walked to the nearest post and crouched beside it, running his hand along the base. "Does it?" He believed it did. He spent 30 years measuring to prove it. "I know. I thought he was wrong for about 20 of those years." He stood and looked at the line of posts running toward the barn. Then I watched the railroad snow sheds he'd told me about fail the same way he said they would, and I stopped thinking he was wrong. He turned and looked at Clara directly. His eyes were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with youth. Your grandfather wrote me a letter 6 months before he died. Said he had a granddaughter who read engineering manuals for pleasure and might be the one to finish what he started. He paused. I didn't believe him. I believe him now. Clara studied him. Are you offering to help? I'm offering to tell you what you're doing wrong before it costs you the whole structure. She looked at the posts. What am I doing wrong? Everything with the bracing. He picked up a stick from the ground and drew a quick diagram in the dirt. The way the post would rack in high wind, the torque it would put on every connection. You've got the cross pieces pinned top and bottom. That's stable in calm weather. In a real blow, the whole thing wants to twist. He made a motion with his hands. You need a diagonal. Triangles don't rack. That's not opinion. That's geometry. Clara looked at the diagram. She looked at her posts. She could see it immediately. The way the force would travel through the structure, the way the connections would fail in sequence. I can fix that, she said. I know you can. He erased the diagram with his boot. That's why I rode up here. His name was Håkon Strand. He had worked railroad construction for 20 years in the high country. Trestles, snow sheds, bridges over canyons that people said couldn't be bridged. He had buried a wife and a son in a slide on the Rabbiters Road 14 years ago now, and he had spent those 14 years measuring every storm against that silence, wondering if better engineering would have saved them. He told Clara this plainly, the way he told her everything, without performance, without expecting comfort, just facts, laid out so they could be looked at. Your grandfather thought the same way I did, he said that first evening, sitting by the stove while Pearl watched him from across the room with her careful attention. That knowledge is a form of protection, that if you understand how something works, really understand it, down to the numbers, you can build around it. He looked at the stack of notebooks on the shelf. He was right about the theory. He just wasn't a carpenter. And you are. I was. He looked at his hands. Lungs are going. Have been for a while. I can't swing a hammer for long before I need to stop, but I can show you how, and I can watch you do it and tell you when you're wrong. He met her eyes. That's the deal I'm offering. What do you want in return? He was quiet for a moment. In the corner, Kettle had gotten up from his spot by the door and walked over to Pearl and sat beside her, and Pearl had put her small hand on his back without looking down, the gesture already as natural as breathing. I want to see it work, Håkon said finally. Before I'm done, I want to see August's theory proven. That's all. Clara looked at the notebooks. She looked at the line of posts she could see through the window, lit faintly by the last of the evening light. Then we'd better start tomorrow, she said. They worked through November and into the early days of December. Håkon came every morning and stayed until his cough forced him to rest, which was earlier each week. He taught her the difference between a joint that looked strong and one that actually was. He taught her how timber behaved under load, how it wanted to compress in some directions and pull apart in others, and how the geometry of a structure either worked with those tendencies or against them. He taught her to read a framing problem the way August had taught himself to read a drift pattern, by watching what happened and asking why. Clara worked until her hands bled, then wrapped them and worked more. Pearl came outside every day. She didn't help with the heavy work. She was too small, and Clara wouldn't have allowed it anyway. But she was always nearby, watching. She picked up dropped nails and held them out without being asked. She pointed at things that looked wrong before anyone else noticed them. She had an eye for it, that child. A quiet, precise attention that noticed everything. Kettle stationed himself wherever Pearl was. The first skeptics came in the second week of November. Myrna Colby, who ran the general store in Glen Rock, arrived on a Wednesday ostensibly to sell Clara a small quantity of lamp oil. But really, Clara understood, to look at the construction and report back to the town. She stood at the edge of the property with her arms folded and watched Clara drive a diagonal brace into place. And then she looked at Håkon, sitting on an upturned bucket with his hands on his knees, resting his lungs. "This is what August Voss's madness looks like up close," she said, not to anyone in particular, just to the air. "It's called diagonal bracing," Clara said without stopping work. "It prevents racking under lateral load." "I don't know what that means." "It means it won't fall over in wind." Myrna looked at the structure. She looked at Clara. She looked at Pearl, who was standing a few feet away holding a tin of nails, watching Myrna with a steady, unreadable gaze. "You're keeping a stray child," Myrna said. "Her name is Pearl. Does she belong to anyone?" "She belongs here." Myrna's mouth tightened. She sold Clara the lamp oil and left without saying goodbye. The next week, standing in her store while Clara bought spikes, she said loudly enough for the two other women present to hear, "August Voss's folly. That's what they're calling it. The old man's madness, now being continued by a girl who ought to know better." Clara counted out her coins. "They can call it whatever they like. The structure will be here when the snow comes." She walked out. Behind her, she heard one of the other women say something she didn't catch, and Myrna laugh in response. She kept walking. Dale Cutter found her at the crossroads on a Saturday in late November, when she was bringing back a load of timber she dragged down from the ridge. He was 22, lean and loud, the son of a rancher who ran cattle on the South Bench, and who had made his opinion of the Voss property known at every opportunity. Dale had his father's mouth and a group of friends who went wherever he went and laughed at everything he said. He looked at Clara's timber. He looked at her hands, wrapped in strips of old wool over the cracked and blistered skin. He looked at Pearl, who was walking beside Clara pulling a smaller piece of wood on a rope. "Still building your grandfather's joke?" he said. "Still working," Clara said, and kept moving. "I've got $2, says you're gone before February." He turned to his friends. "The girl and whatever stray she's keeping?" Clara stopped. She turned and looked at Dale Cutter. She looked at him for long enough that his friends went quiet. "You said that in front of the child," she said. Dale blinked. "What?" "You said, whatever stray she's keeping, in front of her." Clara's voice was level. "She has a name, and she's standing right here." Pearl was standing very still, looking at Dale Cutter with an expression that made at least one of his friends look away. Kettle, at Pearl's side, made a sound low in his chest, not quite a growl. A warning. Dale said nothing. His friends said nothing. Clara picked up the rope attached to her timber and started walking again. Pearl fell into step beside her. Kettle kept pace on Pearl's other side, not looking back. That evening, Clara told Håkon what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the stove for a moment. "People will say things like that," he said. "They'll keep saying them until something changes their minds. The only answer is the structure. I know. Build it right, and it'll speak for itself." "I know." He looked at Pearl, who was asleep on the cot with Kettle curved around her feet. She heard him. "Yes. And she's still here. She's still with you." He said it simply, the way he said everything. "That's not nothing." Clara looked at Pearl too, the way she slept, deeply, quietly, one hand loosely open. She had started sleeping like that only in the past week. Before that, she slept curled tight, every muscle braced, the way a person sleeps when they are never entirely sure they are safe. Something was changing, slowly, but changing. The first crisis came in the last week of November, and it was not about the structure. Clara came back from the ridge one afternoon to find the county sheriff's deputy at her door. A young man named Ferris, apologetic in the way of people who are doing something they've been told to do and would rather not. He had a form in his hand. He explained without meeting her eyes that a complaint had been filed regarding an unregistered child living on the property, and that the county home had a responsibility to children without legal guardians, and that he was required to assess the situation. Clara stood in the doorway and listened to all of it. Behind her, Pearl was at the table with one of August's notebooks open in front of her, not reading. She couldn't yet, but looking at the diagrams with her finger tracing the lines. Kettle was under the table. The stove was going. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and the choke cherry jam Clara had opened that morning. What would happen to her, Clara asked, at the county home? Ferris looked uncomfortable. She'd be housed and fed, with other children. And if someone came to claim her? If a legal guardian appeared with proper documentation, she could be released to them. I'm her guardian. Ferris looked at the form. The county requires documentation for that. A proper filing. Without it. How long do I have? He looked at her then, and she could see that he was not unkind, just caught between what the form said and what was standing in front of him. 30 days, he said, to file a formal petition. He left the form on the step and rode away. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment after he was gone. Then she picked up the form and read it through carefully, twice, the way August would have. The language was dense, but not impossible. There were requirements, a residence, evidence of stable means, a character reference from someone of standing in the community. She went inside. She sat at the table across from Pearl. Pearl had not looked up from the notebook. Her finger was still moving along the curves of August's diagrams. Pearl, Clara said. Pearl looked up. I'm going to keep you here, Clara said. I want you to know that, whatever I have to do. Pearl looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the notebook, her finger moved along the curve of the diagram. It was not nothing. Clara was learning to read her. That night, after Pearl was asleep, Clara sat at the table with the county form and August's notebooks and tried to work out what she had. A residence, yes, barely. Evidence of stable means, almost none. But the cattle, the goat, the root cellar, the rabbit snares, the land itself. A character reference from someone of standing. She thought about Håkon. He had standing, in the way that old men with knowledge do, but he was not from this valley, and his name was not on any deed. She thought about who else had come close to treating her as something other than a curiosity or a joke. Nobody came to mind. Not yet. She put the form aside and opened the 5th notebook. August had kept notes on everything, including, apparently, the legal history of the Voss property and the names of people in Glen Rock Basin who had, at various points, shown what he called basic human decency in difficult circumstances. The list was short. At the top of it, written in August's careful hand, Harland Fitch, attorney, Walden, helped me record the deed in 1872 without charging me the full fee. An honest man in a place where that was not the rule. Clara wrote the name down on a separate piece of paper. 2 weeks later, in the first days of December, she found the 15th notebook. It was not in the crate with the others. It was in a separate place, behind a loose board at the back of the highest shelf in the cabin, wrapped in a cloth that had once been part of a shirt. It was thinner than the others, fewer pages, and the handwriting inside was different, more deliberate. The words chosen more carefully. On the first page, August had written, Clara, if you are reading this, you stayed. Good. She had to put it down. She sat with it closed in her hands for a full minute before she could go on. The notebook was not about drift mechanics. It was not about the walkway or the measurements or the theory. It was about her, about what he had imagined she might be like, based on the letters her mother had written him years before her death, about the property and what he had hoped she might do with it, about the walkway and why he had built it the way he had, and what it would take to finish it, and what it would mean if she did. And near the end, one paragraph that she read so many times she could have said it without looking. The Valley will tell you, this work is impossible. They told me the same thing for 28 years. They may be right. I do not believe they are right. But even if they are, even if the walkway fails, and the theory is wrong, and I have spent 3 decades on a mistake, even then, the watching will have been worth it. You learn things by paying attention that you cannot learn any other way. You learn that the world has rules. You learn that the rules can be found. And you learn that the person who finds them and acts on them is not always the person everyone expected. I expected you, Clara, even before I knew you. Below that, a postscript. The Cutter Boy will make a wager against you at some point. Do not let it cost you more than a moment's irritation. He made one against me in 1879, and I outlasted him considerably. She laughed out loud in the empty cabin. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her. She put the notebook on the shelf where she could see it from the table, and the next morning she went back to the ridge to cut more timber. Wade Harmon found her at the supply yard in town the 3rd week of November. He was a broad, red-faced man with a voice that carried across any room, and the habit of standing slightly too close when he talked, as though proximity were a form of argument. Still at it, he said. Not a question. Still at it, Clara agreed, loading a bag of spikes into her wagon. I'll give you $15 for the Voss property. He said it the way he might say the weather was cold, as though it were simply a fact, already agreed upon, just needing to be acknowledged. That's more than it's worth. You know it's more than it's worth. Then why are you offering it? He smiled. It was not an unfriendly smile, exactly. It was the smile of a man who was used to getting what he wanted through patience. Because I'm a fair man, And because that land's going to bury you come January, and I'd rather have you solvent and gone than frozen and on my conscience. Clara finished loading the spikes. She turned and looked at him directly. The land isn't for sale. Everything's for sale. Not this. He studied her for a moment. The smile faded, replaced by something more appraising. You're going to tell me it's about your grandfather's work. It's about my grandfather's work. Your grandfather spent 30 years on that bench and died alone and cold and with nothing to show for it. His voice was not cruel, just certain. That's not a legacy. That's a cautionary tale. Then I'll read it differently than you do. She picked up the wagon handles and started back toward the road. Wade Harmon watched her go. The offer goes down in January, he called after her. Things get harder to sell in the cold. She didn't answer, but she heard him. Wade Harmon sent a formal letter the following week. The court date for the property dispute had been set for January the 14th. He had retained 2 witnesses who would testify to August Voss's state of mind in the years before his death. He hoped Clara would consider the $15 offer before that date. After it, the offer would be withdrawn entirely. Clara read the letter twice. Then she put it in the box with the county letter and the guardianship papers and the address note and the tin box that had held Matron Price's letter. She went to the barn and split wood for an hour. It was the most useful thing she could do with what she was feeling. That night, after Pearl was asleep, Clara sat at the table. She took out a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote carefully, in her best hand, "Dear Mr. Harmon, I accept your offer of $15 for the Voss property. I will vacate by the 1st of February. She folded the letter once. She addressed it. She set it on the table and looked at it. Pearl was asleep. Kettle was asleep. The stove made its steady sound. On the shelf, the 15th notebook sat where she had put it. Clara. If you are reading this, you stayed. Good. She had read those words perhaps 30 times. She read them now, across the room, without picking up the book. She picked up the letter instead. She held it over the stove's open door. The paper caught at the corner first, a thin orange line moving inward. And then it was gone. Just ash and the smell of it. She didn't write another one. The next morning, Pearl came to the table before Clara had finished her first cup of water and placed the 15th notebook on the table in front of her. Pearl couldn't read the words. She had placed it there because she had seen the name on the cover, Clara, and understood that it belonged to the person sitting across from her. Clara opened it, read the first line again. Clara, if you are reading this, you stayed. She closed it. She went back to the ridge to cut more timber. On a Thursday in mid-December, Emmett Greer appeared at the edge of the property. Clara saw him from the walkway where she was checking the last section of decking. He was 24, solidly built, with the particular posture of someone who spent most of his life outdoors and had stopped noticing the weather as something separate from himself. He stood at the property line with a tool bag over one shoulder and looked at the walkway with the focused attention of a man calculating something. Clara came down off the structure. "Help you with something?" "Emmett Greer," he said. "I run cattle on the North Bench. My brother Cormac has been coming to learn your building methods on weekends." "I know who you are." He nodded, unsurprised. In a valley this small, everyone knew everyone. "I came to tell you that Wade Harmon spoke to my father last week about our grazing lease on the south section. He said it plainly, the same way Håkon said things that were difficult. The lease runs through Harmon land. Harmon told my father it would be complicated if anyone from our family continued to associate with the Voss property. Clara looked at him. Is that why you stopped coming yourself? Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like a man measuring the distance between what he'd done and what he should have done, and finding it larger than he'd like. Yes, he said, and I'm telling you now because it was wrong and because it's not going to stop me again. He set the tool bag down on the ground in front of him. I brought what I have. Tell me what you need. Clara looked at the tool bag. She looked at him. She had learned in these weeks to assess people the way August had assessed Snow, not by what they said, but by where they went and what they carried when they got there. The last section of decking needs a second set of hands to lay flat, she said. The boards want to bow in the cold. Show me, he said. They worked until the light went. Emmett didn't talk much. He didn't ask questions about the structure or offer opinions about whether it would work. He just did what Clara showed him, carefully and without complaint. And when he did something wrong, she told him, and he did it again. By the time the last board was set, the walkway was complete from end to end. 41 feet of clear path from cabin door to barn entrance, above the zone where snow accumulated, below nothing but open air. Emmett stood on the deck and looked both directions. It's something, he said. It's everything, Clara said. Then, because that had come out with more feeling than she intended. August's theory. If it works, it'll mean he wasn't wrong. It works, Emmett said. She looked at him. You don't know that yet. No. He picked up his tool bag. But I know good work when I see it. He started toward his horse. At the edge of the property, he stopped and turned back. Pearl was standing in the cabin doorway, watching him. He looked at her for a moment. What's her name? He said. Pearl. He nodded. Then he rode away. Clara stood on the walkway in the cold and watched him go and told herself her heart was beating fast because of the work. Pearl appeared at her elbow. She looked in the direction Emmett had gone. Then she looked at Clara. Then she went back inside. She was small, but she noticed everything. By the third week of December, the walkway was complete. 41 feet from the cabin's front step to the barn's main door, 4 feet above the ground, with open decking and a single open-railed side. Exactly as August had drawn it in the 7th notebook 30 years ago. The first real test came that night. A storm moved in from the northwest, not the worst they would see, but real. 6 inches of packed snow and wind that blew steady for 18 hours. Clara woke to silence and went to the cabin door and opened it. The drift against the north wall was 3 feet deep. The yard was a chaos of wind-sculpted white. The path between the cabin and the barn was buried somewhere under all of it, but the walkway was there. She could see the posts above the drifts. She could see the deck, dusted with 2 inches of powder, nothing more. The wind had gone underneath. It had dropped its load on either side, had packed the snow into deep curves below the structure, had left the path itself untouched. Clara pulled on her coat and her boots and climbed the cabin steps to the walkway. She stood on the deck in the early morning light with snow piled 4 feet deep on either side of her and the path clear beneath her feet. And she looked at the barn door at the other end, 30 yards away, reachable without a shovel. She walked it. The boards were solid under her feet. Kettle followed her, testing each step with the same careful attention he brought to everything. At the midpoint, she stopped and looked down. The drift below was enormous, a frozen wave, curved and packed, reaching up toward the deck but not reaching it. The deck was above the storm. The path was open. She reached the barn door and put her forehead against the wood. "You were right," she said. She was talking to August. She was also talking to herself. Pearl was waiting at the cabin door when she came back, standing in the doorway in her too large coat, watching Clara come across the walkway through the early light. When Clara reached the cabin steps and looked up, Pearl's face, that careful, guarded face, had changed. She was not smiling exactly, but something in her expression had opened, the way a window opens into a room that has been closed too long. Clara climbed the steps and stood in front of her. "He was right," Clara said. Pearl looked past her at the walkway, at the snow piled beneath it, at the clear path above. She looked for a long time. Then she looked at Clara, and she reached out, and she put her small, cold hand in Clara's cold hand. She still did not speak. But it was the first time she had reached for Clara, the first time she had crossed that distance herself, without being asked. Clara held her hand and said nothing. Inside, the stove was going. Outside, the storm was over. The walkway stood in the morning light, clear and solid, and exactly what August had drawn in a notebook 30 years ago on a frozen bench in Colorado, for a granddaughter he had never met. 41 feet, 4 feet off the ground, quarter-inch gaps between the planks. The wind surrendered beneath it every time. The letter from Garfield County arrived on a Monday. Clara found it tucked under a stone on the cabin step, which meant someone had ridden out specifically to leave it rather than waiting for her to come to town. That alone told her something. Official correspondence that couldn't wait was never good news. She read it standing on the step in the cold, with Kettle beside her and Pearl watching from just inside the door. The county home had received a second complaint regarding an unregistered minor residing at the Voss property. The initial 30-day period for filing a formal guardianship petition had passed without adequate documentation. A representative would be dispatched within 2 weeks to assess the situation and, if necessary, to transfer the child to county care. 2 weeks. Clara folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went inside and sat at the table. Pearl came and stood beside her. Kettle went to the door and lay down across the threshold. "I'm working on it," Clara said to Pearl, to the room, to herself. That afternoon, Håkan came in from the cold, moving more slowly than usual, one hand pressed against his chest. He sat down heavily on the bench by the stove and didn't speak for a moment. "The county letter came," Clara said. "I saw the rider." He looked at the letter on the table. 2 weeks. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, breathing carefully. "I know Harland Fitch," he said. "He helped me with the deed on my place 4 years back. Fair man. Not cheap, but fair." August mentioned him, an honest man in a place where that was not the rule. Håkan looked up. "Of course he did." He shook his head slightly, something between amusement and grief. "Write to Fitch. Tell him the situation. Tell him August Voss was your grandfather. That'll mean something." Clara was already writing. The days that followed were the hardest she had known since the first week. Harder in some ways, because now she was not just surviving. She was surviving while the clock ran. She worked on the walkway in the mornings, checking every joint. She worked on the guardianship petition in the evenings by stovelight, learning the legal language the way she'd learned drift mechanics, by reading carefully, asking the right questions, refusing to be intimidated by vocabulary. Pearl sat across from her every evening. Sometimes she fell asleep at the table with her cheek on her hand, and Clara would carry her to the cot and cover her, and Kettle would follow and arrange himself at the foot of the bed. Haakon stopped coming on Thursdays. His lungs were too bad for the cold. He came Mondays and Wednesdays instead, shorter visits, more directing than working. Then, in the first days of December, in the entry for the final weeks of August's life, Clara found it. August had written, "I have sent Harlan Fitch's name to Price at St. Bridwell's, along with rail fare for the girl. I have written asking her to send Clara to me immediately. My hands are not what they were, and this work is not finished. I am asking for help for the first time in 30 years." Clara stared at the page. She opened the tin box on the shelf. She took out Price's letter. She read it again, slowly, in the lamplight. Matron Price had written on the same day she received August's last letter, the one with the rail fare enclosed. She had used the money for coal. The orphanage had been running short. 40 children needed heat. She had written to August promising to discuss the matter in spring. August had died before spring. But Price had not burned his letter. She had filed it. And she had copied his address onto a small piece of paper. And she had put that paper in the coat pocket of a 16-year-old girl 3 days before. A will was read aloud in a dining hall. The handwriting in the tin box. The handwriting on the address note. The same careful, upright letters. The same hand. All of it. The same person. She wrote, "I could not send you to him. I believed I was protecting you from something uncertain. I could not leave you without the choice. I have thought about whether this was courage or cowardice, and I have not arrived at a satisfying answer." Clara sat with the letter for a long time. She was not sure what she felt. It was too large and too complicated to be one thing. She thought about the coal and the 40 children and the winter of 1885 at St. Bridwell's when she had been one of those children. She thought about August, alone on this bench, waiting for a letter that came too late. She thought about the address note, folded small and tucked into her coat pocket. The one thing Price had dared to do. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it back and put it in the tin box and put the tin box on the shelf. Pearl was awake. She was lying on the cot looking at the ceiling. "Go to sleep," Clara said. Pearl looked at the tin box. Then she looked at Clara. "I know," Clara said. "I'll tell you when you're older." Pearl considered this. Then she closed her eyes. The barometer fell on the last day of December. Clara had a barometer because August had one, a small brass instrument, old and reliable, mounted on the cabin wall beside the window. She had learned to read it from the fourth notebook, which contained a careful record of barometric pressure going back to 1861, and August's notes on what each reading predicted. A rapid fall in under 24 hours meant something worse than ordinary weather. The barometer had dropped 11 points since morning. Clara stood at the window and looked at the sky. It was the particular color she had come to associate with trouble, not the deep gray of an ordinary overcast, but a yellowed, bruised gray, the color of old ivory gone bad. The light it threw was flat and strange. It made distances hard to judge. Kettle had been pacing since dawn. He didn't pace normally. He was a settled animal. A dog who picked a spot and stayed in it unless there was a reason to move. But since morning, he had been moving from the window to the door, to the back corner of the cabin, and back again, unable to settle. Clara watched him pace and thought about the records in the 7th notebook. The winter of 1873, the winter of 1879, the winter of 1883. Each one preceded by exactly this kind of pressure drop. Each one lasting between 2 and 4 days. Each one capable of producing drifts of 8 to 12 feet in open ground. Clara put on her coat. She started with the Greer place, because it was closest. Emmett answered the door. She told him what the barometer showed and what Kettle was doing, and what August's record said about northwest wind following this kind of pressure drop. "How long?" he said. 48 hours before it arrives, maybe 60, then 2 to 4 days of it. He nodded. "I'll secure the cattle. You should come to the cabin when it starts. The walkway—" "I know what the walkway does." He said it quietly. "I'll be there if we need it." He paused. "You'll be safe? You and Pearl?" "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went to secure his cattle. The Reverend was less receptive. Reverend Aldous ran the small white church at the center of Glenrock Basin with the confidence of a man who believed that God's plan included weather, and that therefore weather was not the province of girls with barometers. He listened to Clara's account of the pressure reading and August's historical records with an expression of patient tolerance. "The Lord sends what he sends," he said. "We prepare ourselves spiritually and trust in his provision." Spiritual preparation won't keep your congregation warm if the church loses its windows in a 60-mile-an-hour wind, Clara said. He looked at her the way adults sometimes looked at her, as though she had said something they found embarrassing on her behalf. "Thank you for your concern," he said, and closed the door. Wade Harmon didn't open his door at all. She could see movement behind the curtain, someone inside, looking out. The door stayed shut. Myrna Colby at least listened. She stood behind her counter with her arms folded while Clara explained the barometer and the records and what August had observed in the winters of 1873 and 1879. "And if you're wrong," Myrna said, "then I've wasted an afternoon, and you've had an unusual conversation." Myrna's arms tightened across her chest. "August said the same kind of things for 20 years. Came into this store telling us about pressure readings and wind patterns and what his notebooks showed." "And the times it wasn't nothing special?" Myrna was quiet for a moment. "The winter of 79, she said. People lost cattle. The Hennessy family lost their barn entirely. August predicted that storm. He came in here a week before, told Harold to move his cattle off the north slope." Myrna's voice had changed. Something in it was less certain. "Harold didn't. Lost 40 head. Clara looked at her. "The barometer reading today is the same as August recorded in the week before the 79 storm. I checked it 3 times. Myrna looked at the counter. She looked at Clara. Something was working behind her expression, some calculation Clara couldn't quite read. "What would you have me do?" she said finally. Not a question, exactly. "Bring your family to the cabin when the storm starts. There's room. The walkway will hold, and the cabin will hold, and the temperature inside will stay above freezing, even in the worst of it." Clara paused. "August designed it for this. He designed all of it for exactly this." Myrna said nothing, but she didn't say no. Dale Cutter was at the crossroads. He had 3 friends with him, and when Clara explained what the barometer showed, he laughed the kind of laugh that was meant to be heard. "The orphan girl is scared of sunshine," he said to his friends. They laughed too. Clara looked at Dale. She thought about the note in August's 15th notebook. "The Cutter boy will make a wager against you at some point. Do not let it cost you more than a moment's irritation." "The Hennessy barn," she said. "Winter of '79. Your father was at the Hennessy place the day it came down." Dale's face changed. "How do you know that?" "August wrote it down." She turned and started back toward the road. "When the wind starts, stay inside and stay warm. That's all." She heard him say something to his friends behind her, something she didn't catch. Then one of the friends laughed, uncertain this time, less than before. She walked back toward the property without looking back. The sky had darkened while she'd been in town. The yellowed gray had deepened to something closer to iron. The wind had picked up, not gusting yet, just steady, pressing against her back as she walked. Kettle met her at the edge of the property. He had stopped pacing. He stood very still at the fence line, nose into the wind, reading something in the air that Clara could feel but not name. "I know," she said. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. She followed. Pearl was at the table with the 15th notebook, the one addressed to Clara, open in front of her. She couldn't read the words, but she had it open to the last page, and she was looking at something written there. When Clara came in, Pearl looked up and then looked back at the page and put her finger on a word. Clara sat down beside her and looked at the word Pearl was pointing to. It was Clara's name. Pearl looked at her. She pointed at the name. She pointed at Clara. "Yes," Clara said. "That's me. He wrote that for me." Pearl looked at the name for another moment. Then she closed the notebook carefully and pushed it across the table to Clara. Clara sat with it in her hands and felt the weight of it. Not heavy, just a small notebook, fewer pages than the others, and thought about August writing her name on that page, alone on this bench, in a cabin that leaned slightly east, as though listening for news that was slow to arrive. He had expected her, even before he knew her. She put the notebook on the shelf where she could see it from the door. That night, the wind found the gaps in the cabin walls and came through in thin, cold threads. Not howling, not yet. Just probing, testing, the way a real storm begins before it commits. Clara lay on the floor beside the stove and listened to it and ran through everything in her mind. The walkway, complete. The barn, secured. The cattle, in the stalls with feed enough for 4 days. The root cellar, stocked with everything she had. The woodpile, tall against the south wall, out of the direct wind. Pearl was on the cot. Kettle was between them, on the floor, alert. Clara lay in the dark and listened to the wind searching the walls. The wind screamed. It didn't build to it. Didn't work up through grades of severity the way weather usually did. It arrived in full force between one breath and the next. A sound like the world deciding to tear itself apart and committing to the decision completely. The cabin walls didn't just shudder. They groaned, a deep structural sound. Wood under stress, remembering that it was wood, and that wood has limits. Clara was on her feet before she was fully awake. The stove. She went to the stove first, checked the damper, checked the pipe. Both intact. The fire was still going. She added 2 pieces of wood, more than the nightly ration, but the wind was pulling heat from the walls faster than she'd calculated. Pearl was sitting up on the cot. Kettle was standing, ears flat, looking at the door. "We're all right," Clara said. "The structure will hold." She didn't know that yet. She believed it. She had built it to hold. She had built it the way August designed and Håkon taught. She had checked every joint and every brace. But she did not know. She went to the window. Outside was white, not dark, white. The wind carrying so much snow in the air that the night had a texture, a moving density that caught what little light came from the cabin and scattered it into something formless. She could not see the barn. She could not see the posts of the walkway. She could not see anything at all beyond 6 feet from the glass. She stood at the window and listened to the wind trying to get in and felt the cold radiating through the glass and thought, 48 hours, maybe more. Behind her, Pearl got off the cot and came and stood beside her. She put her small hand into Clara's hand, the way she had started doing, reaching across the distance herself without being asked. They stood together at the window and looked out at the moving white. "August knew this was coming," Clara said. "He measured every storm like this for 28 years. He built the walkway so we could still reach the barn, so the cattle could still be fed, so whoever was here would be able to hold on." She paused. "That's what we're going to do." Pearl's hand tightened slightly in hers. Kettle came and sat beside them, his shoulder against Pearl's leg. The wind screamed and the cabin held, and the three of them stood at the window and watched the storm arrive. Then, through the white, there was a sound, distinct from the wind, lower, more deliberate, a rhythm that did not belong to weather. Knocking. Clara moved to the door before she had decided to move. She put her hand on the latch and looked back at Pearl. Pearl had not let go of her hand. Kettle was between them and the door, ears up, reading whatever came through the cracks. Not a growl, just attention. Alert, not afraid. Clara opened the door. Dale Cutter stood in the opening. Behind him, barely visible in the white, were two shapes, a woman and a child. The child wrapped in every piece of fabric Dale had apparently been able to find. The woman carrying nothing except the child, and the particular expression of someone who has run out of options and knows it. Dale's face was gray with cold. He did not look at Clara. "The roof," he said. His voice was barely audible against the wind. "The roof came down on the west side. My boy," he stopped, started again. "My boy is cold." Clara looked at the child in the woman's arms. 4, maybe 5. His lips were not quite the right color. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Get by the fire." She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "I warned you." She did not say anything except what was needed. Dale came in. His wife came in with the boy. Kettle stepped aside to let them pass, and then went back to the door and looked out into the white, because there was weather still coming, and more than one set of footprints in the snow outside, and the storm had barely begun. Clara closed the door against the wind and went to put more wood on the fire. The night was just starting. By midnight, there were 19 people in the cabin. They came the way trouble always comes, not all at once, but in waves, each arrival bringing with it a new layer of cold and desperation, and the particular humility of people who have run out of alternatives. Clara opened the door 8 times in 4 hours. Each time, the wind tried to come in with whoever was standing there. Each time, she held the door against it and said the same thing. "Come in. Get by the fire." She said it to Dale Cutter's family first. She said it to the Aldous family when the Reverend arrived 20 minutes later with his wife and 2 daughters, the church's east window gone, and the interior temperature dropping fast. She said it to old Bertram Holt, who ran the feed store and lived alone and had walked half a mile in the storm because the alternative was not walking at all. She said it to 3 ranch hands from the Greer Properties South operation, men she didn't know by name, who arrived together with frost on their eyebrows and hands too cold to knock properly, just pressing their palms flat against the door. She said it to Myrna Colby at 10:30 when Myrna came with her youngest daughter pressed against her side and her expression set in the particular way of a woman who has decided to do something difficult and is committed to doing it without comment. She said it to Wade Harmon at 11:45. He came alone, no horse. He came on foot through the worst of it, and when Clara opened the door, he was standing there with his hat in both hands and snow in every fold of his clothing. And he looked not like the man who had offered her $15 for her grandfather's land, but like a man who had been reduced to what he actually was, which was just a person in a storm. He didn't speak. He stood there. "Come in," Clara said. "Get by the fire." He came in. He sat down on the floor near the east wall, as far from the center of the room as he could get, and he did not speak to anyone for a long time. Clara counted heads. 19 people and 3 animals in a one-room cabin designed for one person and the occasional visitor. The floor was covered with bodies, some sitting, some already lying down, children arranged closest to the stove, adults taking the walls and the corners. The air smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, and the particular closeness of too many people in a small space in winter, which is not unpleasant exactly, just very human. The temperature inside held at 52 degrees. Clara had checked the thermometer twice. 52 was not warm, but it was survivable. It was 30 degrees warmer than the air outside, which was dropping toward -30 and still falling. The walkway was the reason they could breathe. 3 times that night, Clara pulled on her coat and went out through the cabin door and across the walkway to the barn. The walkway held. The snow piled on either side of it reached chest height by the second trip. A frozen geometry of accumulated wind, but the deck above it stayed clear. She could walk it without a shovel. She could bring back feed and water without losing her direction, without fighting through a drift that would have swallowed her to the shoulder. August had built her a road through the storm. She used it. The barn was packed with sound, cattle moving, the goat complaining at her usual volume, the horses stamping. All alive, all fed. Clara checked each animal quickly, efficiently, the way Håkon had shown her. She found no signs of cold stress. On the 3rd trip, coming back across the walkway with a pail of water that steamed slightly in the cold, she stopped at the midpoint and looked at the drift beneath her. It was enormous. Taller than she was now, a wave of packed white reaching up toward the deck but stopping below it. The deck above was dusted with an inch of powder, nothing more. The wind moved underneath and took the snow with it and left the path clear. 28 years of watching, 14 notebooks, 1 walkway. She stood there for exactly 1 breath, feeling what it was to be right in the way that cost something. Not triumphant, not relieved, just certain, which is the most important thing. Then she went back inside. The cabin had settled into its nighttime configuration. Dale Cutter's boy, his name was Henry, Clara had learned he was 4 years old, was asleep closest to the stove, wrapped in every spare blanket Clara owned. The color had come back to his lips. His breathing was even. Pearl was sitting against the east wall with Kettle beside her and Henry's mother, Louise, sitting on Pearl's other side. Reverend Aldous was awake in the corner, sitting with his hands on his knees, looking at the stove. He had stopped looking like a man who had answers. Myrna Colby was asleep against the south wall, her daughter's head in her lap, one hand moving automatically to smooth the girl's hair, even in sleep. Wade Harmon was still awake at the east wall. When Clara came back in from the third barn run, he watched her hang up her coat and check the thermometer and add a log to the stove, with the attention of a man who is reevaluating something significant and is not sure yet what the reevaluation will cost him. Clara didn't look at him. She had nothing to say to Wade Harmon that the storm hadn't already said better. She sat down beside Pearl. Pearl leaned against her slightly, just shifting her weight in that direction, the way she did when she was tired and felt safe enough to be tired. Kettle put his head on Pearl's knee. The stove made its steady sound. Clara sat in the middle of 19 people who had spent the last 2 months calling her grandfather's work a joke and calling her a foolish girl for continuing it. And she did not feel the satisfaction she had imagined she would feel. She felt tired and responsible and aware of Henry Cutter's breathing in a way she would be aware of it all night. And she felt the weight of the walkway on the other side of that door as though it were something she carried in her body, which it was, in a way. She had cut every board. She had driven every nail. She stayed awake. She was not sure how much time had passed when Pearl moved. Pearl had been sitting very still, in the way she sat when she was watching something with full attention. Henry Cutter had woken up an hour ago and had been sitting beside his mother, not crying, not complaining, just looking around the cabin at all the people and the dog and the stove, with the wide, careful eyes of a child who is processing more than he can say. Pearl was looking at him. Henry looked back at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Henry looked at Kettle, who was still with his head on Pearl's knee, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow. "Does the dog bite?" Henry said. His voice was small and hoarse, and it cut through the sound of the wind and the breathing of 18 sleeping people, as though the room had been waiting for it. Pearl looked at the boy. She looked at Kettle. She looked back at the boy. And then Pearl spoke. Her voice was low, lower than Clara expected, given how long it had been since she'd used it. Not a child's voice exactly. Something that had been held very still for a long time, and was not sure yet how much to trust the air. "No," Pearl said. "Kettle doesn't bite people who need him." The room had gone absolutely still. Clara did not move. She was afraid to move, afraid that any sound or motion might close whatever it opened, might send Pearl back to the silence the way a startled bird goes back to cover. She sat with her shoulder against Pearl's shoulder and felt the warmth of her and did not make a sound. Henry looked at Kettle for a long moment. Then he slid off his mother's lap and crossed the few feet of cabin floor and sat down in front of Pearl and put his hand out, palm up, the way children do when they want to let an animal make the decision. Kettle lifted his head from Pearl's knee. He looked at Henry's outstretched hand. He leaned forward and sniffed it once, thoroughly, and then he put his chin on it. Henry made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, but was something between the two. Louise Cutter, beside Clara, pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. Dale Cutter, across the room, had turned his face to the wall. Clara could see what it cost him to hold himself still. Myrna Colby was awake now. She was looking at Pearl with an expression Clara had never seen on Myrna's face. Not the assessing, guarded look she wore in the store, but something open. Something that looked like it hurt. Reverend Aldous had his hands clasped and his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly, which Clara supposed was prayer, and which seemed, under the circumstances, appropriate. "His name is Kettle," Pearl said. Henry nodded seriously. "Why?" Pearl glanced at Clara. The first time she had looked at Clara since she started speaking. Clara met her eyes. She felt something in the back of her throat that she controlled because this was not the moment to fall apart. "Because when Clara found him," Pearl said, "he was sitting next to an empty kettle by the barn, and he looked like he was waiting for it to be filled." Henry considered this. "Is it filled now?" Pearl looked at the dog. "Yes," she said. "I think so." In the east wall, Wade Harmon reached into his coat and took out a folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on the floor beside him and did not touch it again. Clara saw him do it. She did not say anything. Håkon had been asleep in the corner nearest the stove since shortly after he arrived. He slept with his back against the wall and his hands in his lap, and his breathing audible over the storm, a wet, careful sound. He woke just past what Clara estimated was 2 a.m. He opened his eyes and looked at the room. He looked at Dale Cutter's family, at the Reverend, at Myrna, at Wade Harmon in the corner. He looked at Henry and Pearl sitting together with Kettle between them, Pearl talking quietly now, telling Henry something Clara couldn't hear. Then he looked at Clara. His face did something she didn't have a name for. It was not exactly a smile. It was the expression of a man who has arrived at the place he was trying to get to and finds it is exactly what he hoped. "August would have loved this," he said. His voice was low, meant only for Clara. "Every person in this room. He built all of it for exactly this moment." Clara looked at the room, at the 19 people her grandfather had never met, sheltered by the work he had started and she had finished, warm in a cabin that should by rights have been cold, alive because of a walkway that everyone had called a joke. "I know," she said. Håkon closed his eyes. "Good girl," he said, so quietly she wasn't sure she'd heard it. He did not open them again. She sat beside him for a while after his breathing changed. Not long. She had other people to watch, other fires to tend, but long enough. She put her hand over his and felt the temperature of him and knew what it meant. And she sat with that knowledge in the way of someone who is learning that grief and gratitude can occupy the same moment. He had gotten what he came for. He had seen it work. She covered him with the coat she'd had across her lap and went to check the fire. 19 people. 1 girl, 16 years old, and a child who hadn't spoken in months. And they all made it through the worst blizzard in 50 years. What would you have done in her place? The storm peaked somewhere in the hours before dawn. The cabin groaned under sustained pressure applied and held. The wind was not gusting. It was constant, which was worse in some ways and better in others. Constant meant predictable. Constant meant the structure knew what it was dealing with. She went out once more before light. The walkway was buried from below. The drift had grown to nearly her height on both sides, a narrow canyon with the deck as its ceiling and the storm as its walls. She walked through it with her head down and her coat pulled tight, and she could feel the wind moving beneath the boards, through the gaps. The air that had kept its speed, because the structure gave it room to pass. The cattle were standing. The water was not frozen. The temperature in the barn was 38 degrees. She stood in the barn for 1 minute, just breathing, in the animal warmth and the hay smell, and the sound of creatures that were alive because of August's notebooks and her hands, and 4 months of work that everyone in that cabin had called foolishness. Then she went back across the walkway to the 19 people who were alive for the same reason. Dawn came slowly, the way winter dawns do, not a brightening so much as a lessening of dark. The storm was not over, but the peak had passed. Clara could hear the difference. The wind was starting to gust, which meant it was starting to weaken. Pearl had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder sometime after 3, between one sentence to Henry and the next, simply gone without announcement, her weight settling and her breathing deepening, and her hand still loosely holding the edge of Clara's sleeve. Clara had not moved. Henry had fallen asleep against his mother, one hand still resting on kettle. The cabin breathed in and out with 19 people. On the east wall, the folded piece of paper that Wade Harmon had taken from his coat was still on the floor beside him. Clara could not tell from across the room what the paper was. She could make a reasonable guess. She did not look at it for long. She looked instead at Pearl, at the particular piece of Pearl's face in sleep. Not the braced, careful stillness of her early nights, but something that had softened, that had found its way to something closer to rest. She was talking to Henry when she fell asleep. She had been talking, the first words in however long, and they were about the dog who didn't bite people who needed him. Clara rested her cheek against the top of Pearl's head. Outside, the wind found its first gap, and through that gap came something different, not warm, but still. A pocket of stillness inside the gusting, a breath between words. The storm was breaking. August Voss had been right. Clara Voss, 16 years old, sitting in the dark with a sleeping child on her shoulder, and 18 other people breathing around her, and a dog keeping watch at the door, held that knowledge the way you hold something you have been carrying a long time, quietly, carefully, aware of what it cost and what it was worth. She did not sleep. She watched the light change. She listened to the storm find the beginning of its end. She felt Pearl breathing against her side, and she thought about August writing her name in a notebook on this bench, alone, in a winter that must have felt very long. She thought about what he had written. If you are reading this, you stayed. The light came slowly through the east window, gray first, and then something almost white, and the wind began, finally, irrevocably, to drop. Clara looked at the room, at all the people in it. She stayed. The storm took 4 days to finish what it started. When the wind finally dropped on the morning of the 5th day, the basin looked like a different world. The familiar shapes of Glenrock, the church steeple, the feed store roof, the line of cottonwoods along the creek, had been rearranged by the snow into something softer and stranger, as though the land had been given the chance to forget what it had been and was deciding what to become. Clara opened the cabin door at first light and stood on the step and looked at it. The drift against the north wall reached the eave. The yard was unrecognizable, not a flat white field, but a landscape of its own, ridges and valleys and curved formations that the wind had sculpted with the same patient geometry August had spent 30 years studying. The posts of the walkway rose above it all, evenly spaced, exactly where she had put them. She walked to the barn and back without a shovel. She did it slowly, deliberately, so that when she reached the cabin door and turned around, the 19 people standing in the yard, all of them who were well enough to stand, which was most of them, could see what she had done. What the walkway had done. What August had drawn in a notebook in 1871, and what she had built with her own hands in the fall of 1886. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Bertram Holt, the feed store owner who had walked half a mile in the storm rather than be found frozen 20 feet from his own door, said quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." It was not an apology. It was not a reckoning. It was just a man looking at something that worked and saying so, and it was, Clara thought, the most honest thing she had heard in 4 months. The cattle were alive. All 22 of them. She counted twice. The calves were thin, but standing. The goat was indignant about the noise and the cold and the general disruption to her routine, which Clara took as a sign of robust health. She stood in the barn and counted and recounted and let herself feel it. The full weight of it, all the mornings she had gotten up before light and gone to the ridge for timber, and all the evenings she had sat at the table with the county form and the legal dictionary, and all the nights she had lain awake listening to the wind try the walls. It had worked. It had all of it worked. She allowed herself 30 seconds. Then she went back to the people who needed her. Dale Cutter did not come to her. She had expected, in some unexamined part of herself, that the storm would have settled something between them, that surviving together in the same room for 4 days would have made him see her differently. He left on the second morning after the storm broke. He helped his wife and Henry into the wagon he borrowed from Bertram Holt and drove away from the property without looking back. Clara watched from the walkway. She thought about August's note. The Cutter boy will make a wager against you at some point. Do not let it cost you more than a moment's irritation. The wager had been made. The answer had been given. Dale Cutter's answer to that answer was to leave without looking back, and that was, Clara supposed, an answer too. 3 days after the storm cleared, Cormac Greer came to the property with his hat in his hands and told her they had found Dale in the snow, 200 yards from the Cutter cabin. He had gone out during the storm, the third night, when the wind was still at its worst, and had not come back. Clara stood on the walkway and looked at the basin and did not speak for a long time. He was heading this direction, Cormac said. He was 17, and he said it carefully, the way young people say difficult things when they are trying to get them exactly right. From the tracks we could read, he was heading toward the property. Clara looked at the distance between the Cutter cabin and the Voss property. 200 yards from the Cutter place was perhaps a mile from here. He had been trying to reach her. She looked at that fact and let it be what it was. Not triumph, not justice, just a man in a storm who had finally understood something and had not gotten far enough to say so. Henry was alive because Dale had brought him here. That was real. That was something. Pearl came and stood beside her. She took Clara's hand, the way she did now, easily, naturally, without announcement. And they stood together on the walkway in the cold morning light and looked at the basin. After a while, Pearl said, "Will we go to the service?" "Yes," Clara said. "We will." They went. They sat at the back of the church and they said nothing and they left before anyone spoke to them, which was the right thing. Not everything needed to be a conversation. Myrna Colby came to the property on a Thursday, 5 days after the storm. She came alone, without her daughter, which meant she had something to say and had decided to say it without an audience. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the walkway for a long time. Then she walked to where Clara was working, resetting a fence post that the wind had heaved, and stood there until Clara looked up. "I owe you an apology," Myrna said. Clara straightened. "For the things I said in the store, for the name, Voss's Folly. For the 20 years I said the same kind of things to your grandfather and called it common sense." Myrna's voice was controlled but not without effort. August Voss was right. He was right about the storm, and right about the walkway, and right about everything I told people was nonsense. And I'm sorry. For him, and for you. Clara looked at her, at the effort in Myrna's face, the particular cost of an apology that is made not because circumstances require it, but because honesty does. He knew what he was doing, Clara said. He just ran out of time. I know that now. Myrna looked at the walkway between the cabin and the barn. He deserved better from this valley. You both did. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, slowly, at the edges first. Thank you, she said, for coming. Myrna nodded. She turned to go. Then she stopped. Your grandfather measured the storm of 79, she said, without turning back. He came to the store that week and told Harold Hennessy to move his cattle. I was there. I heard it. I didn't say anything when Harold didn't listen. I should have. She walked back toward town without looking back. Clara stood in the yard for a moment after she was gone. Then she went back to the fence post. Reverend Aldous came on a Saturday. He did not knock. He stood at the edge of the property until Clara noticed him and walked over, which she thought was appropriate. A man learning to wait for permission to enter. He reached into his coat. He brought out a letter and delivered a statement simply, without preamble. The letter is a character reference for your guardianship petition. For Pearl, it speaks to the quality of your care for the child and the stability of the household. I have signed it in my capacity as minister of this congregation. He met her eyes. It is the truth. I am sorry it took me this long to see it. Clara took the letter. She read it through once, standing there in the cold. It was thorough and precise and generous. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He started toward town. Then he turned back once. The barometer, he said, the one your grandfather used. Is it the same one you read before the storm? Yes. I would like to learn to read it, if that's something you would be willing to teach. Clara looked at him, at the real question underneath the stated one, which was, will you forgive me enough to share what you know? Come by on Wednesday, she said. I'll show you the notebooks. Wade Harmon came on a Monday. He came on horseback, dismounted at the property line, and walked to where Clara was working with his hat in his hands. Clara kept working. I'm withdrawing the suit, he said. The property dispute. I've sent notice to the court. Clara set down the board she was holding. I'm also withdrawing the complaint to the county about the child. Both complaints. Filed this morning. Clara looked at him. She looked at the hat in his hands. Really looked at it. At the way he was holding it. Both hands. The posture of a man who has come to a place he didn't expect to be. Why? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather offered me the same information he offered everyone else in this valley. Every year for 20 years, I chose not to listen. He looked at the walkway. My south herd is gone. 400 head. 40 years of breeding. The cattle that are alive in this basin right around are alive because of August Voss. And because of you. That's the truth. And I know it. Clara said nothing. The land is yours, he said. It was always yours. I should have said so in October. He put his hat back on. He turned to go. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for anything. He simply left, walking back toward his horse with the deliberate, contained gait of a man carrying something heavy that he has accepted is his to carry. Clara watched him go. She did not feel the satisfaction she had imagined she would feel at this moment. She had imagined it would feel like something releasing. It felt like loss. Not her loss. His. And that was not satisfying. That was just sad. Pearl appeared at her elbow. She had a way of doing that, materializing when something significant was happening, as though she had a sense for the moments worth witnessing. Was that the man who wanted our land? Pearl said. Yes. Pearl watched him right away. Is he keeping it? No. He's giving it back. Pearl considered this. Did you want him to say he was sorry? Clara looked at her. Pearl looked back with those serious, direct eyes that saw everything and flinched at nothing. I thought I did, Clara said. Pearl looked back at the retreating figure. My mother used to say that some people show sorry with their actions, and some with their words, and the ones who do it with actions usually mean it more. She said it simply, the way she said everything now, carefully, having considered it, meaning it exactly. Clara looked at her. It was the first time Pearl had mentioned her mother. Clara held that gently, the way you hold something fragile, not because it will break, but because it deserves the care. She sounds like she was wise, Clara said. She was, Pearl said. She knew a lot of things. They stood together for a moment. I know things too, Pearl said then. Different things. I know you do, Clara said. You're going to know a great many more. Harland Fitch arrived from Walden on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the storm. He was a small, precise man with reading spectacles and a leather satchel that he opened on Clara's table with the efficient movements of someone who respected other people's time as much as his own. He read through Clara's guardianship petition. He read through the character reference from Reverend Aldous. He read through the property deed and the withdrawn complaints from Wade Harmon and the county. He read August's notebooks, not all of them, but the relevant sections, tracing August's claims with his finger. When he finished, he looked at Clara over his spectacles. This is an unusual situation, he said. I know. A 16-year-old seeking legal guardianship of a 6-year-old with no documentation. In any other circumstances, I would tell you the likelihood was poor. I know. He looked at Pearl, who was at the table doing her letters. She had started lessons in January, working through the basics with a focus that Clara found unsurprising, with Kettle asleep under her feet. However, he said, you have a reverend's endorsement, a property deed in good standing, documented evidence of extraordinary competence, and the testimony of 19 people who spent 4 days in this cabin during the worst storm in 50 years and are alive to describe it. He reached into his satchel and took out a document. I have taken the liberty of preparing the filing, he said, with the fee waived. Your grandfather helped me with a land survey in 1873 and refused payment. I have been looking for a way to return the favor. He set the document on the table. Clara looked at it, at the careful legal language, at Pearl's name written in the official script of the county court, at her own name beside it. Sign at the bottom, Fitch said. I'll file it Thursday. Pearl looked up from her letters. She looked at the document. She looked at Clara. Clara signed her name. Matron Edna Price arrived in late February on a church relief wagon that had been working its way through the basin distributing supplies. Clara saw the wagon coming from the walkway and knew somehow, before she could see clearly, who was on it. Price was smaller than Clara remembered. Older. Her collar was the same tight white, her posture the same controlled uprightness, but something in her face had changed. The permanent expression of a woman offended by hope had given way to something more complicated and more honest. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at the property. At the cabin, the barn, the walkway between them. She walked the length of the walkway without speaking, testing each board, her black coat stark against the remaining snow. When she reached the barn end and turned around, she looked at Clara across the 41 feet of clear path. He was right, she said. Yes. Price walked back. She stopped in front of Clara and reached into her coat and brought out two things. A letter in August's handwriting. The original, the one that had come with the rail fare, and a small envelope. This is what I should have sent you 4 months ago, she said, holding out the envelope. Inside was a document from the Garfield County Court. Pearl's guardianship, filed and approved, signed by the county judge. Fitch had mentioned he knew the judge. He had not mentioned what he was willing to do about it. I called in the last favor I had, Price said. The judge is an old acquaintance. Consider it what I owe you. Clara held the document. She felt Pearl beside her. Pearl had come out of the cabin when the wagon arrived, and she was standing close, reading the situation with her careful attention. Is she yours? Price said. Looking at Pearl, Clara did not hesitate. Yes, she is mine. Price looked at Pearl for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not sentimentality, something more interior than that. A reckoning of some private kind. I was wrong about the land, Price said. I was wrong to intercept your grandfather's letter. I told myself I was protecting you from uncertainty, but I was protecting myself from responsibility. I am sorry for what it cost you, both of you. Clara looked at her, at the woman who had read the will aloud in a dining hall while 40 girls laughed, at the woman who had taken August's rail fare and put it toward coal, and thought perhaps that she had made the better choice. You put the address in my pocket, Clara said. That one thing. It was not enough. No. Clara paused. But it was something. And it was the something that got me here. Price looked at the walkway. She looked at the basin, white and recovering. She looked at the sky above Glenrock Basin, which was the particular blue of late February at altitude. Cold still, but edged with a quality of light that knew spring was somewhere on the calendar. He believed in you, Price said, before he ever met you. He wrote me 3 letters about you. He described your mother's letters, the questions you asked as a child, the way you read. She looked at Clara. He said you would either be someone who changed things or someone who was changed by them, and that he suspected you were the former. Clara said nothing for a moment. He was right about that too, she said. Professor Edmund Ward from Colorado Agricultural College arrived in May, when the snow had cleared enough to see the system whole. He was a meticulous man with his own notebook, and he spent 3 days walking the property, measuring, sketching, asking Clara questions about every decision she had made and why. He read August's 14 notebooks. When he finished, he looked at Clara with an expression she recognized, the same expression Håkon had worn when he first saw the walkway from the road. "This is 30 years of original observation," he said. "What your grandfather built here, methodologically, is as rigorous as anything published in the engineering literature, more rigorous than most." He paused. "And what you built is the proof that he was right." "Will you write it up?" Clara said. "I already have the outline." He closed his notebook. "With your permission, I'll credit both of you. August Voss for the theory and the observations, Clara Voss for the construction and the proof." He shook her hand. Clara Voss, her name and her grandfather's, on the same page, in the same sentence. The man who had spent 30 years watching snow on a bench that everyone called a waste of time, and the girl who had come to finish what he started. She shook Ward's hand and did not trust her voice for a moment. The circular was published that fall. Drift-managed winter access. Observations and applications from North Park, Colorado. August Voss and Clara Voss. Emmett Greer proposed in the spring of 1888. He did it on the walkway, which Clara suspected he had chosen deliberately, and he did it simply, which she knew was not an accident because Emmett did nothing without considering it. He had Pearl's approval already. Pearl had told Clara a week earlier, with the direct certainty that characterized everything she said, "Emmett is going to ask you something." I told him yes. Clara had opened her mouth and closed it again, and Pearl had gone back to her reading. They married in June, in the cabin, with Kettle sitting between Pearl and Cormac Greer in the front row, and Reverend Aldous officiating with the particular solemnity of a man who understood that this was the least he could do. 20 years passed the way years do when you are working. Pearl Voss became a school teacher. She taught in the cabin through winters, and in the yard through summers, and she taught every child in the basin without distinction. And she taught them all to read August's notebooks the way she had learned, by tracing the diagrams first, by learning the shapes before the words, by understanding that knowledge is a form of care that can be passed between people across time. Cormac Greer became an engineer. He built drift-managed access systems for 14 ranches in the basin and 4 in the next valley over, and he taught the methods to anyone who asked, which was what Clara had asked him to do. Kettle died in the spring of 1907, on a Wednesday, on the walkway, which was where he spent most of his time in his later years. Clara found him in the morning, lying on his side in the early sun, calm and complete. She buried him on the rise west of the barn, beside the place where Håkon's ashes had been scattered. Håkon had wanted no marker, just the elevation so he could watch for bad carpentry. Pearl carved the stone herself. It said, "Kettle." He kept watch. He never bit anyone who needed him. The year Pearl carved the stone, she was 27 years old, and her own daughter was 6. And her daughter traced the letters on the stone the way Pearl had once traced August's diagrams, learning the shapes of things before she fully understood what they meant. Clara stood on the rise in the spring sunshine and watched her granddaughter trace the letters on the stone and thought about August sitting at his table, writing her name in a notebook for a girl he had never met. Chain of care. That was what it was. August to the notebooks, to Clara, to Pearl, to Pearl's daughter, tracing the letters of a dog's name on a stone in Colorado in the spring of 1907. The final scene, years later, was exactly what August might have drawn in a notebook if he'd had the gift of seeing forward instead of backward. Clara, older now, sitting on the walkway in the late afternoon light. Pearl's daughter, 8 years old, dark-eyed and careful in the way Pearl had been careful, watching everything, sitting beside her. "Did you really build this?" the girl said. "When you were 16? "My grandfather designed it. I built it." "Were you scared?" Clara looked at the basin, at the mountains beyond it, at the sky above the ridge where she had cut timber 30-some years ago with cracked hands and 17 cents and 3 matches. "Every single day," she said, "and I built it anyway." The girl looked at the walkway. She put her hand on the rail the way Pearl used to put her finger on the diagrams, tracing the shape of something to understand it. "Will you teach me?" she said. "Like August taught you?" Clara looked at her, at the seriousness in her face, the same quality Pearl had carried, the same quality that had walked across a cabin floor in the middle of a blizzard and put its hand into Clara's hand without being asked. "I'll teach you everything," Clara said, "the way he taught me, through the notebooks, through watching, through refusing to stop looking at something until you understand why it works." The light was going. The basin was turning gold below them, the snow long gone, the grass coming in on the lower slopes, the creek running clear and fast with the last of the melt. The walkway was solid under them, the boards weathered now but sound, each joint still tight, each diagonal brace still holding. Somewhere below, Pearl was calling the girl for supper. Clara sat for another moment after the girl ran down. She sat with her hand on the rail and her eyes on the mountains, and she thought about August, alone up here, watching the snow, writing it all down for someone he imagined but never saw. She hoped he would have been pleased, not surprised. He had expected her, he had written so, but pleased perhaps at the specifics. At Pearl, at Kettle, at Emmett, at the 14 notebooks in a glass case by the door now, at the circular in the box on the shelf, at the basin full of living cattle every winter because the walkway worked, and because Cormac taught it to everyone who would learn. She hoped he knew, in whatever way the dead know things, that she had stayed. She got up and went inside. The walkway stood in the evening light. The snow would come again in October, as it always did, and it would pile beneath the boards and leave the path above clear, and someone would walk across it to the barn and back without a shovel, and it would mean exactly what it had always meant, that the person who had built it understood something true about how the world worked, and had built around that truth instead of against it, and had left the door open for whoever came after. In the spring of 1924, a researcher from the Colorado State Historical Society came to Glenrock Basin to measure and document what people in the valley had simply come to call the Voss system. He spent 3 days on the property, taking measurements with instruments more precise than anything August had owned. He recorded the cabin temperature, the drift formations, the structural integrity of the walkway after 38 winters. His report confirmed what August had written in the first notebook and what Clara had proven in the winter of 1887. The numbers matched. They had always matched. A marker was placed at the property line the following year. It read, Voss System, 1886, designed by August Voss, built by Clara Voss, age 16. Still standing. Snow always tells you where the wind surrendered. Build where it does not. If you are facing your own storm right now, remember her. She was 16 years old. She had 17 cents, 3 matches, and 14 notebooks written by a man she had never met. And she built something that lasted 100 years.